You know, there are moments in life when you realize something fundamental has been wrong all along, like finding out the ground beneath your feet was never actually solid. That's exactly how it felt growing up in my household, though I didn't have the words for it until I was much older. When you're raised inside a particular kind of normal, even the most twisted rules can feel like just another part of daily life, like brushing your teeth or making your bed. But looking back now, I can see how deeply abnormal it all was, how the weight of those morning rituals shaped everything about who I became and almost destroyed who I could have been. Every single morning at 6 o'clock sharp, my father would line us up in the hallway outside the master bathroom. The ritual never changed, never wavered, not for holidays or birthdays or even when someone was sick. My mother would go first, stepping onto that digital scale in her thin nightgown, her face already composed into an expression of calm acceptance. Then my older sister Jessica, who was 16 when I was just 9 years old. Then me. We'd stand there barefoot on the cold tile, watching those red numbers flicker and settle, holding our breath until we knew whether the day would be normal or whether someone would be taken away. Because that's what happened if the number went up, even by half a pound, even by a few ounces that could have been water weight, or the natural fluctuation of a living body doing what living bodies do. If you gained weight, you were locked in the spare bedroom at the end of the hall until you lost it again. I remember the first time I truly understood what was happening. I must have been around 7 or 8, still young enough to think parents could do no wrong, still trusting enough to believe everything they did was for our own good. My mother had been locked away for 3 days straight because she'd retained water during her period, something I didn't understand at the time but would come to know all too intimately in the years ahead. When my father finally opened that door and let her out, she stumbled into the hallway like someone who'd been lost in the desert. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, dried out from dehydration. Her skin looked papery and grey. She could barely walk without holding onto the wall, her legs shaking with every step. But when she finally made it to where my father stood watching, she smiled up at him with this grateful, almost worshipful expression, and thanked him. She actually thanked him for helping her stay beautiful, for caring enough about her appearance to discipline her when she couldn't discipline herself. That image is burned into my memory forever, my mother's grateful smile even as she could barely stand upright, even as her body screamed with the evidence of what had been done to it. At the time, I thought that was love. I thought that's what it meant for a man to care about a woman, to keep her in line, to help her maintain the standards she couldn't maintain on her own. My father nodded at her with this satisfied expression, like a teacher whose difficult student had finally learned an important lesson, and then he sent her straight to bed to rest before the next morning's weigh-in. Because the ritual never stopped, not even for recovery. Especially not for recovery. By the time I turned 14, I'd witnessed my sister Jessica pass out twice from hunger and exhaustion. The first time happened during a family dinner when she was 17. We were all sitting around the table, the men with their plates piled high with pot roast and mashed potatoes and buttered rolls, while we women picked at our carefully portioned salads with oil-free dressing and plain grilled chicken breast. Jessica had been on a particularly strict regimen because she'd gained 3 pounds the month before. 3 pounds, my father said, made her look puffy and unattractive. She'd been eating less than 800 calories a day for 2 weeks, trying to lose not just those 3 pounds but an additional 5 to prove she was serious about maintaining her figure. I watched her fork pause halfway to her mouth, her eyes going unfocused and glassy. Then she just slumped forward, her face landing in her plate with a soft thud that seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly silent dining room. My father didn't even get up from his chair. He just gestured to my Uncle Marcus, who was visiting from across town with his own family, and together they carried Jessica to the couch in the living room. They propped her up and waited for her to come around, which took maybe 5 or 6 minutes that felt like an eternity. When she finally opened her eyes, groggy and confused, my father's first words weren't asking if she was okay or whether she needed water or medical attention. He said, "You're still weighing in tomorrow morning, and if you've gained weight from retaining fluids, you know what happens." Jessica nodded weakly, tears streaming down her pale cheeks, and whispered that she understood. We all went back to our dinners like nothing had happened, though I couldn't taste anything I put in my mouth after that. The second time she passed out was worse because it happened at school, in front of people outside our family who didn't understand our way of life. Jessica collapsed during gym class while running laps, and the school nurse called an ambulance before anyone could stop her. At the hospital, the doctors ran tests and discovered she was severely malnourished and dehydrated. Her electrolytes dangerously imbalanced. Her blood sugar so low it was a wonder she'd been functioning at all. They wanted to admit her for observation and treatment, but my father arrived within the hour with his lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit who somehow got the hospital to release her into his care with nothing more than some stern warnings about proper nutrition and hydration. On the drive home, my father didn't yell or scream. He simply told Jessica that she'd embarrassed the family, that she'd drawn unwanted attention to our private household matters, and that her punishment would be extended another week in the spare bedroom once she'd recovered enough to handle it. Jessica apologized over and over, her voice hoarse and broken, promising to be more careful about when and where she showed weakness. Living in that house meant learning to see food as the enemy, your own body as something that constantly betrayed you, that couldn't be trusted to maintain the right shape or size without constant surveillance and correction. My cousin Rachel, who was just 13 at the time, taught herself to vomit after meals. I discovered her secret one evening when I went to use the bathroom after a family gathering and heard the unmistakable sounds coming from the powder room downstairs. When she emerged, her eyes were red and watery, her breath smelling of stomach acid, despite the mouthwash I could see she'd tried to use to cover it up. We looked at each other for a long moment, both of us knowing what the other knew, both of us trapped in the same terrible understanding. She grabbed my wrist and whispered, "Please don't tell," her fingers digging into my skin with desperate strength. I promised I wouldn't, and I kept that promise even though watching her destroy herself in that particular way broke something inside me. The men in our family ate without restriction, piling their plates high at every meal, going back for seconds and thirds, snacking between meals without a second thought. They developed round bellies and thick necks, their bodies expanding with middle age in the way bodies naturally do, and nobody said a word about it. Nobody weighed them or measured them or locked them away until they lost weight. Their bodies were allowed to simply exist, to be, to take up space in the world without constant justification. But for the women and girls, every ounce mattered. Every pound was scrutinized. Every fluctuation required explanation and often punishment. We learned to calculate everything we put in our mouths, to understand calorie counts and carbohydrate ratios before we even learned algebra, to see our reflections in mirrors and on scales as the ultimate measure of our worth and our acceptability. The rules were laid out clearly and repeated often enough that we all knew them by heart. Every female in the household over the age of 12 had to weigh in every single morning at 6 o'clock. No exceptions. If you were sick, you weighed in. If you were on your period, you weighed in. If you'd been up all night with insomnia or stress or any of the other pressures that came with living under constant surveillance, you still weighed in. If the number on that scale went up from the previous day, even by half a pound, you went to the room. The room was what we called it, never the punishment room or the starvation room or any name that might make plain what it actually was. Just the room. Like it was some neutral space rather than a converted bedroom with locks on the outside, and nothing inside except a bare mattress and a bucket, for when they wouldn't let you out even to use the bathroom. The only exception to the weight rules was pregnancy, which was celebrated and encouraged because it meant you were fulfilling your proper role as a woman. When you were pregnant, you were allowed to gain weight according to what your doctor recommended, and nobody questioned the numbers on the scale as long as you had that medical excuse. But even that grace period had its limits. You had exactly 6 weeks after giving birth to get back to what they called your marriage weight, the weight you'd been when you got married, regardless of how many years or pregnancies had passed since then. If you couldn't lose the baby weight within that 6-week window, you went back to the room just like any other time, new mother or not, regardless of whether you were still healing from delivery or struggling with postpartum recovery. My Aunt Patricia spent 4 weeks in the room after her third baby because she couldn't drop those last 8 pounds fast enough. I was 11 years old and watched my uncle bring her meals through the door, single servings of plain vegetables and water, while she cried and begged to hold her newborn, who was being cared for by my grandmother in another room. When she finally reached her marriage weight and was released, she was so weak she could barely lift her baby, and something in her eyes had gone flat and dead in a way I'd never seen before. That's how I grew up, thinking this was just how life worked, that all families operated this way, that fathers and husbands weighed their women every morning and locked them away for the crime of being human. I thought the constant hunger was normal, that the exhaustion and dizziness and hair loss were just part of being female. I thought passing out from low blood sugar was something that happened to everyone, not a sign that your body was literally starting to shut down from lack of nutrition. I didn't know any different because I'd never experienced anything different, and none of us talked about it outside the family. It was our private business, our way of maintaining standards and discipline. And we were taught from an early age that outsiders wouldn't understand, that they'd try to interfere and destroy the carefully maintained order of our household. But then something happened that changed everything. I was 15 years old, a sophomore in high school, and it was wrestling season. My brother Thomas was on the school team, and I'd watch his matches sometimes after my own classes let out. That's when I started noticing something fascinating, something that made my mind light up with possibilities I'd never considered before. The wrestlers would show up to weigh-ins looking gaunt and exhausted, having starved themselves and sweated off water weight to make their weight class. But then the very next day they'd look completely normal again, sometimes even bigger and stronger, because they'd rehydrated and eaten properly in the hours between weigh-in and competition. They were manipulating their weight deliberately, dropping 5 or even 7 pounds overnight and then gaining it back just as quickly. And they did it through scientifically understood methods rather than actual starvation. I became obsessed with understanding how they did it. I'd corner Thomas after practice and ask him endless questions about water loading and dehydration cycles, about using saunas and hot baths to sweat out water weight, about the exact timing of when to stop drinking fluids and when to start again. He thought I was just curious about his sport, maybe considering joining the girls' team or writing a paper for health class. He had no idea I was learning these techniques for an entirely different purpose, one that could change everything for the women in my family. I stayed up late researching on the school library computers because we weren't allowed unsupervised internet access at home. I learned about diuretics and electrolyte balance, about how the body retains and releases water, about temporary weight fluctuations versus actual fat gain. I learned that the scale was lying to us, that the number it showed was never the full story, that weight could shift by several pounds in either direction without any real change to a person's body composition or health. The more I learned, the angrier I became. All those years of punishment and starvation, all those days and weeks locked in that room, all that suffering could have been avoided if we'd just understood how bodies actually work. My mother hadn't gained real weight during her period. She'd retained water the way every woman's body does as part of the natural hormonal cycle. Jessica hadn't failed at discipline. Her body had been trying desperately to survive on inadequate nutrition while still functioning as a growing teenager. Rachel hadn't needed to make herself vomit. She could have eaten proper meals and still maintained a stable weight through understanding and working with her body's natural processes instead of against them. We'd all been suffering needlessly, punished for being human, tortured for having bodies that worked exactly the way bodies are supposed to work. But I couldn't keep this knowledge to myself, not when I had the power to help them. Not when my little cousin Sarah, who'd just turned 13 and started her required weigh-ins, was already crying herself to sleep with hunger every night. Not when Jessica was losing clumps of hair from malnutrition, finding them on her pillow every morning and stuffing them deep in the trash so my father wouldn't see and accuse her of being dramatic. Not when my mother's bones were starting to show through her skin in ways that looked almost skeletal, her body cannibalizing itself to meet impossible standards. I had to do something, but I had to be careful about it. Our father and the other men monitored our communications, checked our phones randomly, listened to our conversations. I couldn't just send out a group text explaining what I'd learned. I needed a cover story, a reason for us to gather and talk privately without raising suspicion. That's when I proposed the sewing circle. I told my mother I wanted to learn traditional embroidery, that I wanted to connect with the other girls in the family through feminine crafts, that it would be a nice way for us all to bond and learn useful domestic skills. My father approved immediately, proud that I was embracing what he saw as appropriate female activities. He even bought supplies for us, fancy embroidery hoops and threads in every colour, pattern books and fabric. Every Thursday afternoon we'd gather in the basement rec room, ostensibly to work on our needlecraft projects. And we did work on them, actually. We learned to embroider flowers and birds, to do cross-stitch and needlepoint, creating samplers and decorative pillowcases that we'd present to our parents as proof of our productive afternoon. But between the stitches and the pattern discussions, I taught them other things. I taught them everything I'd learned about temporary weight manipulation, about how to drop 3 pounds overnight without actually starving yourself, about using natural diuretics and carefully timed water consumption to make the scale show what our fathers needed to see without destroying our bodies in the process. I started with the basics, teaching them about caffeine pills as a natural diuretic, explaining how drinking extra water for a few days and then cutting back sharply before weigh-in could create a temporary drop on the scale. I showed them how to track their menstrual cycles so they'd know when their bodies would naturally retain more water, how to plan ahead for those times by dropping extra weight in the days before so the natural retention wouldn't push them over their allowed limit. We became scientists of our own bodies, learning to understand and predict the fluctuations that had always been treated as moral failings, turning survival into something we could control at least partially. Sarah was the quickest study, maybe because she was the youngest and hadn't been broken down yet by years of this system. She started keeping detailed notes in a journal she hid under her mattress, tracking her weight morning and evening, noting what she ate and how it affected the scale, recording her cycle and how her body responded. Within a month, she could manipulate her morning weigh-in number by up to 4 pounds in either direction, eating full meals while still hitting her target weight when it mattered. Jessica was more cautious at first, scared after everything she'd been through, but once she saw it working for the younger girls, she committed fully. She stopped making herself dizzy with starvation and started eating proper meals, real nutrition that made her hair stop falling out and brought colour back to her face, and still managed to show the same steady low weight every morning when my father checked. My cousin Emma, who was 17 and about to start college in the fall, cried the first time she ate a full dinner without fear. We were at my house for the Thursday sewing circle, and my mother had made lasagna for the family meal that evening. Emma had been restricting herself to a single small portion of salad for dinner every night for the past 2 years, terrified of gaining even an ounce that might trigger a punishment. But I'd taught her the technique of water loading in the days before, drinking extra fluids to force her body to release stored water, and then timing her meals perfectly so she could eat normally while still showing a loss on the scale the next morning. She took a full serving of lasagna, with garlic bread on the side, and as she chewed that first real bite of substantial food, tears just streamed down her face. She whispered thank you over and over, and I realized this wasn't just about weight or avoiding punishment anymore. This was about reclaiming some small piece of autonomy, some tiny bit of control over our own bodies and our own lives. But I taught them something else too. Something that felt even more dangerous than the weight manipulation techniques. I taught them to document everything that was happening to us. I showed them how to use their phones to take pictures of the scale readings, to record audio of the sounds of doors locking when someone was sent to the room, to hide old phones in places where they could capture evidence of what was really happening in our family. I explained to them about screenshots and cloud storage, about backing up files in multiple locations so nothing could be truly deleted or destroyed. I told them to track their own health metrics, to notice when their periods stopped from malnutrition, to photograph the clumps of hair they found on their pillows, to document the dizzy spells and fainting episodes. Because some part of me knew, even though I couldn't fully articulate it yet, that what was happening to us wasn't right, that someday we might need proof, that the truth of our experience needed to be preserved, even if we couldn't yet imagine when or how we might use it. For about 7 months, our system worked almost perfectly. We ate better, felt healthier, and still managed to satisfy the morning weigh-in requirements. The men noticed that we seemed happier and more energetic, and they praised themselves for maintaining such effective discipline, for creating a household where their women understood the importance of standards and worked hard to maintain them. My father would brag to his brothers and friends about how well trained we were, how none of us had required punishment in months, how we'd finally learned self-control and discipline. He had no idea we were eating full meals and manipulating the scales, that the numbers he saw every morning were carefully orchestrated illusions rather than the results of constant restriction and suffering. But eventually, inevitably, our secret got discovered. It happened on a random Tuesday morning in March, 6 months into our weight manipulation routine. My Uncle Marcus had bought a new scale, one of those old-fashioned mechanical ones with the sliding weights and the balance beam, the kind that couldn't be hacked or reprogrammed or manipulated with magnets the way we'd learned to do with digital scales. He decided to surprise everyone with this new scale, showing up at our house unannounced for a family weigh-in because he was so proud of his purchase and wanted to demonstrate what he believed was superior accuracy and reliability. When he set it up in our hallway and called for the women to line up, I felt my stomach drop. I knew immediately what was about to happen, what this would reveal, but there was no way to warn everyone or prepare them. One by one, we stepped onto that mechanical scale, and one by one, the truth came out. My mother, who'd been showing a steady weight of 112 pounds on our digital scale, suddenly registered at 117. Jessica jumped from 124 to 130. Sarah, little Sarah, who'd been so careful and diligent with her tracking and planning, showed 5 pounds heavier than what she'd weighed on the digital scale just that morning. The pattern was unmistakable. Every single woman in the household, every girl who'd been part of the sewing circle, was suddenly and inexplicably 5 pounds over what we'd been showing for months. The men went absolutely insane. You could see it happening in real time, the way understanding spread across their faces, followed immediately by rage. My father's expression went from confusion to comprehension to fury so fast it was almost like watching a physical transformation. Uncle Marcus started shouting about deception and lies, about how we'd made fools of them, about the betrayal of their trust. My cousin David's father, Uncle Robert, was already pulling out his phone to call the other families, to alert them that something had gone wrong, that the women had been conspiring together. The immediate response was to send everyone to the punishment rooms, but there weren't enough actual designated rooms for all of us. So they improvised, using regular bedrooms, closets, even the basement. They were dragging girls by their arms toward various parts of the house, and the sounds of crying and pleading filled the air. My little cousin Grace, who was only 14, started screaming as Uncle Marcus pulled her toward the spare room. She was fighting him, actually physically fighting, trying to break free from his grip, and in her panic and desperation, she started shouting the truth. "We haven't gained weight," she screamed, her voice breaking and raw. "We've been faking the numbers. We've been eating this whole time. We've been hacking the scales." The room went completely silent. Even the men froze, processing what she'd just said. Grace pulled out her phone with shaking hands, pulling up months of documentation. She showed them our group chat with its careful instructions and techniques. She showed them videos we'd recorded of teaching each other how to reprogram digital scales. She showed them time-stamped photos of girls eating full dinners at night and then showing weight losses the next morning. She showed them everything, all the proof of our deception, our secret rebellion, our carefully maintained illusion of compliance while we lived our own lives beneath the surface. Uncle Marcus grabbed the phone from her hand, his face turning a deep purple as he scrolled through the evidence. The other men gathered around to look, their expressions shifting from anger to something darker, something that felt truly dangerous. "You poisonous little manipulator," Uncle Marcus hissed at Grace, raising his hand to strike her. His palm was already moving toward her face when we all heard them, the sirens, multiple police cars screaming down our quiet suburban street. Grace looked up at her father through her tears, and even though her cheek was already red where he'd grabbed her, even though she was shaking with fear, she smiled. She smiled and said, "I've been live streaming for the past 12 minutes. The police are here because people called them after watching." The front door burst open before any of us could fully process what she'd said. Police officers flooded into our house, their radios crackling with codes and communications, their presence filling up the space that had always felt so closed off and private. A female officer, she had these kind eyes that looked almost out of place in the chaos, knelt down beside Grace, who was still clutching her phone like a lifeline. The lead officer, a tall man with greying hair and an expression that suggested he'd seen too much in his career, raised his voice to be heard over the confusion. "Everyone needs to separate into different rooms," he announced. "We'll be conducting individual interviews with each family member. Nobody leaves the premises until we understand what's happening here." My father was the first to recover his composure, straightening his tie and clearing his throat, shifting immediately into the persona he showed to the outside world, the respectable businessman and community member. "Officers," he said in his most reasonable voice, "this is clearly a misunderstanding. We run a health-conscious household. These girls are being overly dramatic about simple dietary guidelines. It's a generational conflict, nothing more." The other men quickly fell in line behind his lead, nodding and murmuring agreement. Uncle Marcus added, "We encourage healthy eating habits, nothing more than what any concerned parent would do. We certainly haven't done anything illegal or abusive. But these officers weren't buying it the way other people usually did when my father turned on the charm. They'd seen Grace's live stream, or at least they'd heard about it from the concerned callers who'd reported what they were watching. Within about an hour, Child Protective Services arrived with their own team of social workers. They set up operations in our living room, creating makeshift interview spaces with portable dividers they'd brought with them, treating our home like it was a crime scene. I watched from the kitchen doorway as they led my younger cousins away one by one, each girl clutching her phone or a notebook, whatever documentation she'd managed to gather. These girls had evidence ready because I'd taught them to collect it, though I'd never imagined it would be used quite like this. My sister Jessica went into her interview looking pale but determined, her jaw set in a way I recognized as her gathering courage. When she emerged 43 minutes later, the social worker walking beside her had a grim expression, the kind of face that suggested she'd heard things that were going to stay with her for a while. The men had gathered in the dining room by this point, huddled together around their phones, making frantic calls to people we couldn't see or hear. Family members, I assumed, or maybe their lawyers, trying to figure out how to control a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond their control. By evening, a lawyer did arrive, expensive suit and leather briefcase, and an air of authority that filled the room before he even spoke. He gathered the men in my father's study, and we could hear their muffled voices through the walls, the rise and fall of strategy being planned and stories being coordinated. Over the next several days, our house became something like a war zone of legal maneuvering. The lawyer, his name was Richard Sterling, and he apparently specialized in defending families against what he called government overreach, coached the fathers on exactly what to say and how to say it. The narrative shifted quickly and dramatically. Those empty bedrooms weren't punishment spaces, they claimed. They were voluntary time-out rooms for prayer and meditation, places where the women could go to reflect and center themselves. The women could leave whenever they wanted, they insisted. The locks were just for privacy, to give them uninterrupted time for spiritual contemplation. The weight monitoring wasn't about control, they said. It was about health education and helping the family maintain wellness standards together. Every harsh reality was reframed, every piece of evidence reinterpreted through this new lens of concerned parenting and traditional family values. My Uncle Marcus became the enforcer of this new narrative, the one who made sure everyone stayed on script. He started showing up at our schools, catching girls alone by their lockers during passing periods or waiting by the parking lot after final bell. My 14-year-old cousin Bethany found a note slipped into her backpack one afternoon, folded into a small square and tucked between her textbooks where she'd find it privately. The note said, "Remember, family stays together, smart girls know when to stay quiet," and we all understood the threat that was wrapped up in those words. Uncle Marcus cornered Jessica outside her chemistry classroom one day, blocking her path with his body in a way that looked casual to anyone passing by, but felt intimidating in the way it was meant to. "Maya's already gone," he told her in a low voice, referring to my cousin who'd been sent away to stay with relatives in another state, supposedly to help her understand the importance of family loyalty. "You want to join her? You want to be cut off from everyone who loves you? Think carefully about what you say to these social workers." The threat worked on some of the girls, especially the younger ones who didn't have the full picture of what was happening or why it mattered. 3 girls from our original sewing circle stopped coming to school altogether. Their mothers kept them home, telling anyone who asked that they were too traumatized by the false accusations to face their peers, that they needed time to recover from the stress of the investigation. But really, we all knew they were being kept home to prevent them from talking to anyone outside the family, isolated and controlled in a new way now that the old methods had been exposed. But the real devastating blow came when I tried to access our cloud storage, all those months of carefully organized evidence that I'd taught the girls to collect and preserve. Every photo, every video, every documented weight chart and recorded conversation, all of it had vanished. The folders were empty. The accounts showed nothing had ever been uploaded. I knew immediately who was responsible, and the betrayal cut deeper than almost anything else that had happened. I found Thomas in his room, sitting at his computer desk and staring at the screen with this hollow expression. My older brother, the one who'd been my source for the wrestling weight manipulation techniques, the tech genius who fixed everyone's phones and helped me set up those secure cloud accounts in the first place. He wouldn't meet my eyes when I walked in. "Dad made me do it," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He knew about the cloud backup. He went through my computer and found the access information. He threatened to cut off all my college funding, to withdraw his support for my education completely. "I've already been accepted to State University on early admission," he said, and his voice cracked a little. "I worked so hard to get there. I can't lose it all because of this." He finally looked up at me, and I could see he'd been crying even though he was trying to hide it. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry, but I couldn't let him destroy my future." The worst part was that I understood. I hated that I understood, but I did. Thomas was 18, about to start his adult life, and our father had him trapped just as effectively as he'd trapped all of us, just through different means. The women were controlled through food and weight, through physical confinement and starvation, but Thomas was controlled through his dreams and ambitions, through the careful distribution of resources and opportunities that could be withdrawn at any moment if he didn't comply. We were all prisoners in our own ways, all of us dancing to rhythms we didn't choose, all trying to survive within impossible systems. The prosecutor assigned to our case called a meeting with those of us who were still willing to testify. She was a woman in her mid-40s named Karen Chen, and she looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than just physical tiredness. Stress lines creased her forehead, and she had the demeanor of someone who'd fought too many battles against systems designed to resist change. Without Maya's testimony, she told us, sitting across from us in a conference room at the courthouse, and with the digital evidence destroyed, this case is getting significantly weaker. The defense is painting this as a cultural misunderstanding about strict parenting. They're bringing in expert witnesses who will testify about various cultural approaches to health and family structure. Without concrete, undeniable proof, this becomes a credibility contest, and these men have resources and community standing that make them very credible witnesses in the eyes of many people. That's when I remembered something I'd almost forgotten in all the chaos and fear and constant pressure of the past weeks. In the early days of teaching the girls about survival techniques, before I'd gotten sophisticated about cloud storage and encrypted backups, I'd shown some of them a simpler method of documentation. I'd taught them to hide old phones in the punishment rooms themselves, phones that could be set to record audio continuously, phones that might still be there capturing evidence even after everything else had been deleted and destroyed. Some of those phones might still be hidden in the heating vents or under loose floorboards, still recording or at least still holding the recordings they'd already captured. The rooms themselves might contain the proof we needed. The opportunity to retrieve them came during my cousin Ashley's wedding. Ashley was Emma's older sister, already 23 and marrying a man our family approved of, someone who shared their values about traditional roles and family structure. The whole extended family would be at the wedding venue, including Uncle Marcus and all the other men who were usually so vigilant about protecting their territory and their secrets. His house would be completely empty for at least 4 or 5 hours, maybe longer if the reception went late. I told my mother I was feeling sick, clutching my stomach and saying I thought I might have caught some kind of flu bug. She barely glanced at me, too focused on getting herself ready and maintaining appropriate appearances at this important family celebration. She told me to rest and left, without a second thought. I waited until I saw the last car pull away from our house, watched through my bedroom window as they disappeared down the street, and then I grabbed my keys and drove across town to Uncle Marcus's house. My hands were shaking so badly I had trouble keeping the car steady. The spare key was still hidden under the fake rock in the landscaping near the front steps, exactly where it had always been. Because men like Uncle Marcus never imagine their security will actually be breached. Inside, the house felt eerily silent, absent of its usual tension and fear. I went straight to the punishment room, which was really just a converted guest bedroom on the second floor, and immediately started working on the heating vent cover where I'd shown my cousin Melissa how to hide things months ago. The screws were stiff and one of them was stripped, but I finally got the cover off with a combination of determination and a butter knife I'd grabbed from the kitchen. 3 phones were inside the vent, all of them still there, though 2 had long since died from depleted batteries. The third one, an old iPhone that had maybe 10% battery left, was still functional. My hands shook as I pulled it out and plugged it into the portable charger I'd brought with me. While it powered up just enough to be usable, I started scrolling through the files it contained. Hours and hours of audio recordings, some of them nearly unintelligible but others crystal clear. The sounds of girls crying, locks clicking, footsteps pacing, and then, like striking gold, my uncle's voice clear as day coming through the speaker. "I know locking them up is technically kidnapping," he was saying to someone else, another male voice I didn't immediately recognize. "But sometimes you have to break small laws to maintain important traditions. These girls need to learn discipline. Without consequences, they'll never understand the importance of maintaining themselves properly." I was so focused on the phone, on securing this evidence and transferring it to my own device, that I didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs. I didn't hear anything until a voice behind me said, "What are you doing here?" I spun around so fast I almost dropped both phones. Standing in the doorway was Michael, my 17-year-old cousin, Uncle Marcus's oldest son. He'd been tasked with checking on the house during the wedding, making sure everything was secure, and here I was, caught red-handed stealing evidence from his father's punishment room. I clutched the phone against my chest, ready to run, ready to fight if I had to, my mind already racing through possible escape routes and explanations. But then Michael did something completely unexpected. He closed the door behind him, shutting both of us inside the room, and leaned back against it. His face wasn't angry or threatening. If anything, he looked relieved. "I've been waiting for someone to find those," he said quietly. He pulled out his own phone and showed me a folder labeled simply "Insurance." Michael explained, his voice low and intense, that he was gay, He'd known since he was 14, but had been hiding it for 3 years, terrified of what would happen if his father found out. "I know what it's like to be trapped by family traditions," he said. "I know what it's like to have to hide who you really are just to survive. I've been recording everything for months now, every conversation I could safely capture, every admission of wrongdoing, every piece of their strategy." We spent the next hour and a half in that room, transferring files back and forth between devices, creating multiple backups, making sure nothing could be lost or destroyed this time. Michael had recordings I never could have accessed, conversations between his father and the lawyer about how to manipulate the legal system, discussions among the men about how to pressure the girls into silence, admissions that they knew what they were doing was wrong but believed it was justified. He had video of his father destroying evidence, of the men coordinating their stories, of things that could change everything about how this case would proceed. "Why didn't you come forward before?" I asked him as we worked. We were sitting on the floor of that terrible room, surrounded by technology that held the truth of what had been done here, and I needed to understand what had kept him silent when he had this power to help us. Michael looked at me with exhausted eyes. "Same reason you taught the girls to manipulate scales instead of calling the police immediately," he replied. "We were all trying to survive within the system before we were ready to destroy it. We were all buying time until we could find a way out that wouldn't crush us in the process. The trial finally moved forward with our new evidence, and this time the defense couldn't make it all disappear with clever reframing and expert testimony. They tried their cultural differences argument, bringing in anthropologists and sociologists who testified about various cultural approaches to family structure and weight management, painting the fathers as well-meaning traditionalists who simply had different ideas about health and discipline than mainstream American society. They found a few doctors willing to speak about the importance of parental guidance in nutrition and the obesity epidemic facing American children. They presented our family as misunderstood rather than abusive, as maintaining standards that might seem strict but came from a place of genuine concern and love. But then something happened that none of us had expected, something that shifted the entire tone of the proceedings. My mother, who had been silent and compliant for 27 years of marriage, who had thanked my father for starving her and locked herself away without complaint, who had taught us all by example that women endure rather than resist. My mother asked to testify. When she stood up in that courtroom, she looked small and fragile in her borrowed dress, her body still bearing the evidence of decades of systematic starvation. But her voice, when she began to speak, was steady and clear. She spoke for the first time about decades of abuse that she'd never named as abuse before. About pregnancies where she'd been locked away for gaining too much weight, even though her doctors said the weight gain was healthy and necessary for the baby. She talked about the times she'd fainted from dehydration, but been told she was being dramatic and attention-seeking, about watching her daughters suffer the same fate and feeling powerless to stop it because she'd been so thoroughly broken down herself that she couldn't imagine any other way of existing. She cried as she testified, not prettily or quietly the way we'd all learned to cry when we needed to show emotion without making anyone uncomfortable, but with deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere she'd kept locked away for longer than I'd been alive. Her testimony opened something like floodgates. Other women who'd been silent started finding their voices, one after another standing up to add their own stories to the record. Aunts who'd been married into the family and learned to accept its rules testified about years of starvation disguised as wellness, about being locked away for normal body changes like menstruation and aging, about being taught that their only value was in the numbers on a scale and the approval of men who measured their worth in pounds and ounces. My Aunt Catherine, Uncle Marcus's wife, spoke about the pregnancy where she'd been locked in the punishment room because she'd gained 32 pounds instead of the 25 her husband deemed acceptable. She'd been 7 months pregnant at the time, huge and uncomfortable and trying to grow a healthy baby, and she spent 4 days locked in that room with nothing but water and plain vegetables while her older children cried outside the door asking when Mommy would come out. The defense attorneys tried everything they could to discredit these women, to paint them as vindictive wives looking for revenge, or as women who'd been coached by prosecutors to exaggerate normal family discipline into something sinister. But there were too many of them, too many similar stories, too many specific details that matched and corroborated each other. And then there were the recordings, Michael's careful documentation, and the audio from the hidden phones, the men's own voices admitting to things they'd never intended anyone outside the family to hear. The judge, a woman in her late 50s named Patricia Williams, listened to everything with an expression that grew darker and more troubled as the days of testimony accumulated. When she finally delivered her decision, her voice was hard and uncompromising. "This is not cultural difference," she said, looking directly at the defense table where the fathers sat in their expensive suits, trying to maintain dignified expressions. "This is systematic abuse. This is false imprisonment. This is child endangerment. This is using basic human needs as weapons of control, and regardless of how you attempt to frame it or what traditions you claim to be upholding, it is illegal and it is morally reprehensible." The sentences ranged from 8 months to 3 years, with Uncle Marcus getting the longest term because of his intimidation tactics and his role in coordinating the cover-up. My father received 2 years. Uncle Robert got 18 months. The others fell somewhere in between depending on the evidence against them and their level of involvement in the conspiracy to obstruct justice. It wasn't everything we'd hoped for. These sentences felt too short for the years of suffering they'd caused, but it was accountability. It was the first time in my entire life that these men had faced real consequences for their actions. The first time someone with authority had said clearly and publicly that what they'd done was wrong. My mother filed for divorce the day after the verdict came down. She didn't wait or hesitate or try to work things out the way so many people expected she would. She went straight to a lawyer that afternoon and started the paperwork to end her marriage and claim her independence. The house became ours in the divorce settlement. My father's lawyer agreed to it as part of the deal in exchange for my mother not pursuing additional civil suits. She immediately began transforming the space, starting with the punishment room. She turned it into a library, lining the walls with bookshelves and filling them with books about women's history and civil rights and psychology and healing. "Words have power," she told me as we painted over the bare white walls in a warm yellow color. "We're filling this room with better ones, with words that build up instead of words that tear down." The sewing circle evolved after the trial, becoming something more official and open. We no longer met in secret in our basement, but in a conference room at the community center, openly advertising our support group for young women recovering from controlling family situations. We still taught embroidery and needlework, still created beautiful things with our hands, but now we did it while talking openly about trauma and recovery, about learning to trust your own body and your own hunger signals, about understanding that your worth isn't measured in pounds or measured at all. New girls joined us, some from similar situations in other families, others just needing a safe space to exist without judgment, to be in their bodies without constant surveillance and criticism. I threw myself into school with an intensity I'd never been able to access before. My grades improved dramatically now that I wasn't spending every night planning weight manipulation strategies and worrying about the next morning's weigh-in. I could focus on actually learning instead of just surviving, and I discovered I was good at school when I had the mental and emotional energy to dedicate to it. A women's rights organization heard about our case through the media coverage and reached out to offer me a scholarship to study law. They said they wanted to support young women who'd experienced injustice and wanted to change systems to protect others. I accepted immediately, knowing exactly what kind of lawyer I wanted to become, knowing I wanted to spend my life fighting for people trapped in situations like the one I'd escaped from. The letters from prison started arriving about 8 months after my father was sent away. His handwriting on envelope after envelope, all addressed to me, all marked with the prison's return address stamp. I developed a ritual around them, taking each letter unopened to the fireplace in our living room and burning it without reading a single word. I'd watch the paper curl and blacken in the flames, watch the smoke carry away words I didn't need to read, thoughts and justifications and probably apologies that wouldn't change anything about what had been done. My mother watched me burn the first few letters, and then she started burning her own letters from him, the two of us creating small ceremonies of letting go and moving forward. 2 years passed faster than I expected. I was at the grocery store near my college campus one Saturday afternoon, just doing normal shopping for the week, thinking about an essay I needed to write for my legal theory class, when I saw him. My father had been released early for good behavior, and he looked so different from the man I'd grown up fearing. He was thinner, older-looking, worn down by his time inside in ways that went beyond just physical appearance. There was something defeated in his posture that I'd never seen before, something that suggested the world had finally broken him the way he'd spent decades breaking others. He started walking toward me when he spotted me in the produce section, his mouth opening to speak, probably to try to start some kind of conversation or reconciliation. I pulled out my phone immediately, holding it up between us, my finger hovering over the record button. The message was clear without me having to say a single word. Anything you say will be documented, will be preserved, will be used if necessary. He stopped mid-step, understanding passing across his features, and for a moment we just stood there in the grocery store, looking at each other across the distance of everything that had happened. Former father and daughter, now strangers separated by abuse and consequences and the impossibility of pretending any of it could be undone. Then he turned and walked away, and I went back to my shopping, my hands only shaking a little bit as I selected apples and lettuce and all the foods I could eat now without calculating their impact on tomorrow morning's non-existent weigh-in. These days I work with girls trapped in similar situations, not as a lawyer yet because I'm still finishing school, but as someone who understands, as someone who's been exactly where they are and made it to the other side. I teach them the same things I taught my cousins all those years ago, but with different endings now. Document everything, yes. Protect yourself, absolutely. Learn to recognize abuse even when it's dressed up as love or concern or tradition. But also know that there's a way out that doesn't involve just hiding and manipulating and surviving in the shadows. There are people who will believe you if you're brave enough to speak. There are systems that can help if you're willing to access them. There are futures that don't involve scales and locked doors and constant fear. Futures where you get to take up space in the world without apologizing for existing. The sewing circle still meets every Thursday evening. My mother runs it now, teaching actual embroidery techniques alongside lessons in recovery and self-worth, creating a space where healing happens one stitch at a time. Sometimes I stop by when I'm home from school on breaks, sitting in the circle and watching new faces learn to create something beautiful with their hands while their bodies heal from years of punishment and control. There's something profound about the metaphor of it, taking separate threads and weaving them together into patterns that hold, into images that tell stories, into tangible proof that broken things can be remade into something whole. My sister Jessica gained 28 pounds in the first year after the trial, and she kept it on, maintained it, let her body settle at the weight it wanted to be without constant restriction and fear. She smiles now, really smiles, not the brittle, careful expression we all perfected for morning weigh-ins and family dinners. She laughs loudly and eats dessert without calculating and wears clothes that fit her body instead of the body she was supposed to have. She's in therapy, we all are, working through the complicated maze of recovery and trying to untangle all the messages we absorbed about worth and value and what it means to be female in a world that constantly measures women. My younger cousins are still struggling, some more than others, but all of them are free now in ways that matter most. They're free to eat when they're hungry, to rest when they're tired, to exist in their bodies without constant surveillance and criticism. Little Sarah, who learned the weight manipulation techniques so quickly all those years ago, is studying to be a nutritionist now, wanting to help people develop healthy relationships with food instead of the toxic patterns she was taught. Grace, the one who live-streamed that morning and brought the police to our door, is in therapy 3 times a week working through the trauma of what she experienced and what she witnessed. But she's also become an activist, speaking at schools and community centers about recognizing abuse, even when it comes from people who claim to love you. And me? I'm learning every day that justice isn't just about punishment and consequences, though those things matter too. Justice is also about prevention, about education, about changing the systems that allow abuse to flourish in silence and isolation. Every girl I help escape, every family I educate about the difference between health and control, every future lawyer I inspire to take on these kinds of cases, they're all stitches in a larger pattern, all threads woven together into something that might eventually be strong enough to catch the next person who falls. The work is slow and often discouraging, but it matters in ways I'm still learning to understand. The scale that controlled our lives for so many years sits in our garage now, gathering dust behind old paint cans and cardboard boxes of seasonal decorations. We thought about throwing it away, smashing it dramatically, or taking it to the dump, but my mother decided to keep it instead. Not as a tool of measurement and control anymore, but as a reminder. A reminder of where we came from, what we survived, what we refused to accept as normal, even when everyone around us said it was. That scale represents the day we finally said enough, the moment we chose truth over compliance, the beginning of something new even though we didn't know yet what that something would become. My phone buzzes constantly with texts from Michael, who's in law school now too, attending a different university but with the same mission and purpose that drives me. We compare notes on cases we're following, share resources for survivors we're helping, plan the legal practice we'll open together someday. Two cousins who found alliance in the most unexpected places, who discovered that sometimes the people you least expect become your strongest allies, working together to make sure no child ever has to choose between family and freedom, between love and safety, between belonging and survival. The punishment rooms are gone now, physically transformed into spaces of healing and growth. That guest bedroom at Uncle Marcus's house was converted into a meditation room by his ex-wife after the divorce, filled with plants and soft lighting and comfortable cushions where people go to find peace instead of endure punishment. Our spare bedroom library grows constantly, new books appearing on the shelves as my mother discovers authors and titles that speak to recovery and resilience. Even Uncle Robert's house, after his wife divorced him and took custody of their daughters, has been transformed, the locked rooms opened and repurposed, the physical spaces that held so much suffering now holding something else, something lighter and more hopeful. But the lessons remain. Not the ones our fathers tried to teach about control and compliance and keeping women small in every possible way, but the ones we taught ourselves and each other about resistance and recovery, about the strength it takes to name abuse as abuse, about the courage required to imagine and then build a different kind of life. These lessons live in every girl who joins our Thursday evening circle, in every woman who leaves a controlling situation because she saw our story and recognized her own, in every person who learns that love doesn't require shrinking yourself to an acceptable size and shape. Every Thursday evening, in community centers and living rooms and church basements across the city, our story continues. It continues in the spaces women create for each other, in the support networks that form when people are brave enough to share truth, in the slow, patient work of healing trauma and rebuilding trust. One stitch at a time, one girl at a time, one freed voice at a time, we're creating something that looks like the opposite of what we escaped from. Something that feels like actual freedom instead of just a cleverer form of survival. The morning after I saw my father at the grocery store, I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about my weight in days, maybe even weeks. I couldn't remember the last time I'd stepped on a scale or calculated calories or worried about whether my body looked acceptable according to someone else's standards. It was such a simple thing, waking up and just existing in my body without that constant background noise of measurement and judgment, but it felt revolutionary in its simplicity. I made myself breakfast, actually hungry in a way I still sometimes forgot I was allowed to be, and ate it while reading a textbook about constitutional law and equal protection under the law. And the ordinary mundane beauty of that moment almost made me cry. Me, because that's what we'd been fighting for all along, even when we didn't have the words for it yet. The right to be ordinary, to be human, to be imperfect, and flawed and changing and alive without constant surveillance and correction. The right to eat breakfast without fear, to occupy space without apology, to exist in bodies that grow and shift and age, and refuse to stay frozen at some idealized moment of supposed perfection. The right to be daughters and sisters and women without having to earn that identity through suffering and compliance, and the slow, patient starvation of everything that makes us human. I think about Maya sometimes, my cousin who was sent away and never came back, who's still out there somewhere living with relatives who support the old family system. We've tried to reach her through mutual friends and social media, tried to let her know that she has a place with us if she ever wants to come home, but she's never responded. Maybe she can't. Maybe they're monitoring her communications and keeping her isolated. Or maybe she's chosen to stay, found some kind of peace or acceptance in a life that looks more familiar, even if it's more restrictive. I hope someday she'll be ready to reach out, to come back, to join us in building something new. But I also understand that healing happens on different timelines for different people, and some wounds take longer to even acknowledge before you can begin to treat them. The prosecutor, Karen Chen, stayed in touch with us after the trial ended. She sends updates about similar cases she's working on, asks for advice about approaching young victims of family control systems, sometimes just checks in to see how we're all doing. She told me once, late in the evening after a particularly difficult hearing, that our case changed how she understood abuse, helped her see patterns she'd been missing in other families. She said watching my mother testify, seeing that transformation from silent compliance to powerful truth-telling reminded her why she'd gone into this work in the first place. "It's those moments that make the hard days worth it," she said. "When you see someone find their voice after years of silence, when you watch them step into their own power and reclaim their story." Thomas, my brother who deleted our evidence and then felt crushed by guilt over it, is working as a school counselor now. He never did go to medical school, couldn't stomach the idea of it after everything that happened, after watching his father use education and opportunity as weapons of control. Instead, he got his degree in psychology and now works with teenagers, watching for signs of abuse and control, creating safe spaces for kids to talk about what's happening in their homes. He called me last month to tell me about a student he'd helped, a girl whose parents were using food restriction as punishment for low grades. He recognized the pattern because of our family, because of what he'd witnessed and participated in, and he was able to intervene before it escalated into something more severe. I could hear the emotion in his voice as he told me about it, the way helping this one kid felt like beginning to make amends for everything he'd failed to stop in our own home. The women who testified at the trial, the mothers and aunts who finally found their voices and told their truths, have formed their own support group now. They meet on Wednesday evenings, working through their own recovery while also serving as resources for other women trying to leave controlling marriages. My mother is part of that group, sitting in circles with women who understand exactly what she survived, who can hear her story without shock or disbelief because they have stories just like it. She's dating someone now, a kind, gentle man who works at the community centre and likes to cook elaborate meals that he serves without any commentary about portions or calories. She giggles when she talks about him, actually giggles like a teenager with her first crush. And it's both strange and wonderful to see her discovering romance and connection that isn't wrapped up in control and conditions. The media attention around our case eventually faded, as media attention always does, moving on to the next crisis or scandal or sensational story. But every now and then, someone recognizes me from the coverage, approaches me in a coffee shop or bookstore to say they saw the story and it made them think differently about their own family or their own situation. Some of these conversations are brief and surface level, just acknowledgement and moving on. But others turn into longer discussions, exchanges of phone numbers and resources, connections that sometimes lead to people joining our support group or reaching out for help escaping their own situations. the ripple effects of speaking truth continue spreading in ways we couldn't have predicted or planned, touching lives and changing circumstances in patterns that feel almost miraculous in their reach. The anniversary of the verdict comes around each year, and we mark it quietly, those of us who are most directly involved. We meet for dinner at my mother's house, the house that used to be my father's house but belongs to us now, and we eat too much and laugh too loudly and stay up late talking about where we've been and where we're going. Jessica brings her girlfriend openly and proudly now that she doesn't have to hide who she is or who she loves. Sarah brings charts and graphs about nutrition science she's learning in her program. Grace shares updates from the schools she's spoken at, the kids who've reached out afterward to tell their own stories. Michael drives in from his law school and shows us the moot court arguments he's preparing about family law and parental rights, and where the lines should be drawn between authority and abuse. These gatherings are both celebration and memorial, marking survival and acknowledging what was lost in the process of surviving. We toast to the women who aren't with us anymore, like Maya, and to the ones who didn't make it through intact, whose recovery has been harder and more complicated than ours. We acknowledge that justice was incomplete, that 2 years in prison didn't balance decades of abuse, that some wounds don't fully heal no matter how much therapy and time and support you throw at them. But we also celebrate how far we've come, the simple profound fact of still being here, still fighting, still creating space for healing and hope, and the possibility of different futures. The scale in the garage has become something of a symbol in our family, referenced in conversations and used as a metaphor for all kinds of things beyond literal weight measurement. My mother talks about stepping off the scale of others' expectations, about refusing to let external judgments determine your worth. Jessica uses it as a reminder that numbers don't tell the whole story of who you are or what you're capable of becoming. Sarah brings new members of the support group to see it sometimes, showing them this physical object that used to hold so much power and explaining how something that once controlled lives can become just a piece of equipment gathering dust once you refuse to give it meaning beyond what it actually is. I'm in my 3rd year of law school now, and the work is harder than anything I've done before, but it feels meaningful in ways that make the exhaustion worthwhile. I'm specializing in family law and children's rights, taking every class and clinic opportunity that helps me understand how to protect vulnerable people within family systems. My professors know my story, most of them anyway, and they sometimes bring me in as a guest speaker when they're teaching about abuse dynamics or the limitations of the legal system in addressing private family matters. Standing in front of those classrooms full of future lawyers, sharing my experience and the lessons we learned, feels like continuing the work in a different form, planting seeds that might grow into protection for families we'll never personally meet. Last semester, I wrote a paper about the intersection of cultural respect and child protection, examining how legal systems can honor cultural diversity while still maintaining baseline standards for children's welfare and bodily autonomy. The research took me deep into case law and international human rights frameworks, but it also took me back through my own memories, re-examining my childhood through the lens of legal theory and human rights principles. My professor gave me the highest grade in the class and submitted the paper to a law review journal where it was accepted for publication. Seeing my name in print, my story and analysis contributing to legal scholarship, felt like another kind of victory. Another way of making sure what we experienced leads to changes that protect others. The rehabilitation facilities that were exposed during our trial faced their own investigations and legal consequences. It turned out they were part of a much larger network of what they called therapeutic boarding schools and treatment centers, places where parents could send rebellious or difficult children to be broken down and rebuilt according to whatever specifications the parents preferred. The girls who'd been sent to these places started coming forward with their own stories of abuse and control, of being held against their will under the guise of therapy and treatment, of having their communications monitored, and their attempts to reach out for help intercepted and punished. Many of these facilities have been shut down now, their operators facing criminal charges or at minimum losing their licenses to operate. but new ones keep opening under different names, finding loopholes in regulations, marketing themselves to desperate parents who want quick fixes for complicated family dynamics. That's part of what drives me forward. The knowledge that this work is never truly finished, that systems of control evolve and adapt even as we expose and dismantle them. For every victory we win, there are new battles emerging, new ways that people find to justify controlling others in the name of love or tradition or what's best for them. Staying ahead of that, building legal protections and social awareness that can prevent abuse before it becomes entrenched, feels like the mission I was somehow prepared for by everything I survived growing up. Like maybe all that suffering and struggle taught me exactly what I needed to know to help prevent others from going through the same thing. The other girls from my original sewing circle have scattered across the country now, pursuing their own educations and careers and healing journeys. We stay connected through group chats and video calls, sharing updates and victories and setbacks. Emma is working as a social worker in a different state, specifically helping women leave abusive marriages and navigate the practical challenges of building independent lives. Bethany went into medicine after all, becoming a pediatrician who specializes in recognizing signs of child abuse and neglect. Melissa teaches elementary school, watching her students for any signs that they might be suffering at home in ways they can't or won't verbalize. We're all doing different work, but we're all essentially doing the same work, using our experiences to create safety for others, to be the adults we wish had been there for us when we needed them. Sometimes I'm asked if I've forgiven my father, if I've found peace with what happened, if I've moved past it all. The questions always come from people who mean well but don't quite understand what forgiveness means in contexts like ours. I haven't forgiven him in the sense of deciding that what he did was acceptable or understandable or somehow less terrible than it actually was. I haven't let him back into my life or created space for reconciliation or relationship. But I have released him from taking up constant space in my thoughts, from having power over my emotional well-being, from being the central figure in my story rather than just one chapter I've moved beyond. That feels like its own kind of peace, not forgiveness exactly, but something like acceptance that what happened happened, and that I'm building a life that isn't defined by it, even though it shaped me. My mother has a different relationship with forgiveness than I do. She says she forgives my father not for his sake, but for her own, because carrying that anger and hurt was exhausting in ways she couldn't sustain. She says forgiveness for her means acknowledging that he was damaged by his own upbringing, that he learned these patterns from his father, who learned them from his father, that abuse cycles through generations until someone is brave enough or desperate enough to break the pattern. Understanding the cycle doesn't excuse participating in it, she tells me, but it helps her make sense of how someone could do those things to people they claimed to love. I respect her perspective even though I can't quite share it yet. Maybe someday I'll get there, or maybe I won't, and either way is okay, part of how we each process and heal from trauma in our own time and our own ways. The courtroom proceedings were public record, and every so often someone finds them and writes about them, usually journalists working on broader pieces about family abuse or child welfare or the limitations of the legal system. We've learned to brace ourselves for these articles, for the way media attention stirs everything up again, brings the past rushing back into the present. Some journalists are respectful and thoughtful, seeking to understand the complexity of what we experienced and centering our voices and perspectives in their coverage. Others sensationalize it, turning our trauma into clickbait headlines and dramatic narratives that flatten the reality into simple stories of villains and victims. We've mostly stopped reading the coverage, trusting that the people who need to find our story will find it, and that how it's packaged and presented is ultimately less important than the fact that it exists as public testament to what can happen behind closed doors in seemingly normal families. The support groups we started have expanded beyond what we ever imagined. There are now chapters in 7 different cities, each one run by survivors who've been through our training program, who understand both the dynamics of family control and the long, difficult process of recovery. We have online support groups too, moderated forums where people from anywhere can connect and share experiences and find resources. The demand is staggering sometimes, overwhelming in its implications about how widespread these patterns of control actually are. Every week brings new members, new stories that are heartbreakingly similar to our own, new reminders that what we experienced wasn't unique or unusual, just hidden and normalized and protected by social pressures that make it hard for people to speak up about what happens in private family spaces. We've also started prevention programs, going into schools and community centers to teach young people about healthy versus unhealthy family dynamics, about recognizing warning signs of control disguised as care, about trusting their own instincts when something feels wrong even if they can't immediately articulate what or why. These programs focus on building critical thinking skills about authority and obedience, helping kids understand that respect doesn't mean blind compliance, that love doesn't require suffering or shrinking yourself to meet someone else's standards. The feedback we get from these programs suggests they're making a difference, with kids reporting that they've recognized concerning patterns in their own families or friends' families and reached out for help or intervention. Michael and I are planning to open our practice together as soon as we both pass the bar exam. We've already chosen the name Resilience Legal Services, and we're working on our business plan and finding funding and making all the practical arrangements that will let us actually do this work we've been dreaming about. We'll specialize in family law cases involving abuse and control, offering sliding scale fees so that cost isn't a barrier to getting help. We're also planning to do policy work, advocating for better legal protections for children and clearer definitions of abuse that include psychological and emotional control tactics, not just physical violence. The work feels urgent and important, and like the culmination of everything we've been through and learned. There are still hard days, days when the weight of memory feels crushing, when triggers come out of nowhere and send me spiraling back into old fears and old patterns. I see a therapist twice a week, working through layers of trauma that keep revealing new depths just when I think I've processed everything there is to process. I've learned that healing isn't linear, that you don't just get better and stay better, that recovery is more like a spiral where you keep encountering the same issues at different levels of understanding and integration. Some days I'm the strong survivor sharing my story and helping others. Other days I'm just trying to get through, just trying to remember that eating is okay, and my body is trustworthy, and the number on a scale, if I ever step on one, is just information rather than judgment or worth. My sister Jessica has become my best friend in ways that weren't possible when we were growing up, when we were all too busy surviving to really connect with each other beyond shared suffering. We talk almost every day now, checking in and sharing our lives and processing memories as they surface. She reminds me of things I'd forgotten or repressed, and I do the same for her, and together we're piecing together a more complete picture of what our childhood actually was versus what we were told it was. Having someone who is there, who understands without explanation, who doesn't need me to justify or prove or defend my experiences, is invaluable beyond what I can articulate. We're building a different kind of sisterhood now, one based on chosen connection rather than just shared trauma, and it's one of the most healing relationships in my life. The younger generation in our family, my cousins who are now teenagers and young adults, are growing up so differently than we did. They eat without fear, exist in their bodies without constant measurement and judgment, pursue their interests and passions without needing permission or approval beyond basic parenting. It's beautiful and sometimes painful to watch, beautiful because they get to have the childhoods we deserved, painful because their freedom highlights what we lost, what was taken from us. But mostly it's beautiful. Mostly it feels like victory, like we broke something that needed breaking, like we changed the trajectory, not just for ourselves but for everyone who comes after us.